Well, coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Deborah Scroggins and her latest book, Wanted Women. In it, she uses the lives of two well-known Muslim women to explore two distinct perspectives on the war on terror and Islamic fundamentalism. She discusses the lives of Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Aafia Siddiqui with former Pakistan Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Akbar Ahmed.
Deborah, you've written a big book. It's an ambitious book. It has a great sweep. Literally, the world is the stage, and you're raising big issues. So without any further ado, let's plunge in.
Okay.
What is your core thesis? What is the heart of the book?
Well, the book tells the story of two women. One is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's the Somali-born activist and the author of the best-selling autobiography Infidel. And she was notoriously threatened with death for her criticisms of Islam. And her polar opposite, who's a woman called Aafia Siddiqui, and she's a Pakistani neuroscientist who for a long time was the only woman wanted as an associate of Al-Qaeda, and was eventually captured in 2008 and convicted of firing at American personnel in Afghanistan. So the book follows these two Muslim women of about the same age who became complete opposites, and it tries to sort of tell the story of the war on terror through their stories.
Two women, such obvious extremes in their positions, and yet you talk about this weird symmetry between the two.
Yeah.
Could you explain this?
Well, as I said, they're about the same age. They came to the West from the periphery of the Muslim world at around the same time, the end of the Cold War, and they both were strongly influenced by Islamism. And even though they turned out, one becoming a critic of Islam, a harsh critic of Islam, and one becoming a harsh critic of the West, it's possible to imagine that they might have gone in opposite directions. Because Ayaan Hirsi Ali, when she was a teenager, she actually belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood. And Aafia Siddiqui, when she was a student at MIT in Cambridge, she studied feminism. So it's possible to imagine that they would have gone in opposite directions. And one of the things that I find fascinating about their stories is, because they're close in age, a lot of times the same historical events affected them in different parts of the world. And so there is that symmetry of seeing how the same events affected their lives.
It's fascinating. This is the subjunctive clause, meaning all kinds of possibilities. They could have gone in either direction. Now you have a striking phrase, the bikini and the burqa, the virgin and the whore, and the need to understand one against the other, without which you cannot understand either. Now, what do you mean by this? Because this, of course, in a sense also sums up the essence of the book, in which you're looking at two such very extreme people, figures, polar opposites, and making sense of them.
Well, if you can't understand, if you don't realize that in one society the bikini seems natural and perfectly accepted, you can't understand how shocking the burqa seems to Westerners, for example. If you are coming from a society where the burqa is accepted and you've never seen a bikini, then you can't understand why the bikini is so shocking to, for example, people coming from Afghanistan or maybe even Pakistan. And so what I was trying to say is that if you don't understand the shadow, you can't understand the light. So I needed to tell both stories in order to give a picture of what roles women were playing in the war on terror and the whole issue of women's rights.
And how did you manage to keep a sense of balance between these two figures? You're coming from American society, obviously you're growing up in a very different kind of cultural environment to someone like Aafia, or even Ayaan Hirsi Ali before she comes to the West. How were you able to keep an objective balance or a neutrality between these characters?
Well, I tried to do it, and I've been writing about the Muslim world for a long time. I was a newspaper reporter and a magazine reporter before I wrote this book, and so I've been writing about the issue of women's rights and Muslim women's rights for more than 20 years. So it's something I've given a lot of thought to, and I just tried to keep my balance as best I could.
And I think you did succeed largely in trying to, because you're really telling two different stories which you're telling in a parallel way.
Yeah.
And I can understand that the story of Aafia Siddiqui here in America sounds very, very different to how it sounds in Pakistan.
Yes.
Because as you point out, the Prime Minister of Pakistan has called her the daughter of the nation. Yeah. There are hundreds of processions in her favor, burnings of the American flag and so on, and people blaming US imperialism for what happened to her. 86 years prison sentence she's serving. And similarly, the opposite for Ayaan Hirsi Ali here in the West. She's a celebrity figure. She's such a big name here. I found, Deborah, that by taking these two women, who both in their own ways have made such a mark on our times, you're creating two poles in the Muslim tent, as it were. But these poles are at the opposite ends of that tent. Now that tent is being held up by mainstream Muslim women.
Right.
Muslim women like you mentioned Benazir Bhutto, for example, who's comfortable both in this world, the Western world, and in her own world in Pakistan, where she wins elections twice and becomes the first female prime minister of any Muslim country. And then is eventually killed for being precisely that, for wanting democracy, women's rights and so on. And there are hundreds of women like her. The first president of Indonesia, Muslim woman, Bangladesh prime minister, Muslim women, and of course ambassadors and governors and so on who are women. The new Pakistan ambassador to Washington, again a woman, a very articulate woman. My own daughters, one of them was a PhD from Cambridge University, became the first ever director of the only Jewish Muslim center in the world at Cambridge.
Wow.
The other one at Georgetown. So these are Muslim women, they're American, British, whatever, but they're still living in their own traditions and comfortably adjusting to the world. Now, the danger is, conceptually, if you remove the center, if you remove this pole from the center, the average reader who knows little about Islam, and there's so much controversy and debate and discussion about Islam today, particularly in the United States, the danger is that that reader may think that these are all that is there on offer, that Muslim women are either completely extremists, they want to blow up everyone, want to blow up the West, want to kill people and so on, and on the other hand, they want to reject Islam, and they say this is a terrible faith. So do you think there's a danger of, in fact, pushing the reader into that trap, almost the intellectual trap, or missing out the mainstream or the central pole?
Well, I don't think so, because in the book I talk about that quite a bit, as you know, that one of the frustrations that Muslim women have had over the last decade is that women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Aafia Siddiqui have crowded out their voices. And that was, I quote a number of women, including, for example, the Nobel laureate, Shireen Ebadi. She was particularly talking about Ayaan, and she said intellectuals like Ayaan Hirsi Ali play the mullah's game because they argue that it isn't possible to have Islam and democracy, that Muslims have to make a choice between the two. And Shireen Ebadi said, I don't agree with that. I think there's a third way. Islam can be compatible with democracy. And the same could be said about Aafia Siddiqui in Pakistan. One of the things that's happened in Pakistan is that women like Asma Jahangir, her voices have been crowded out, and she's accused of not caring enough about Aafia Siddiqui because Aafia Siddiqui is imprisoned by the West. So I think that's one of the most important points that the book has to make, that these are not the only voices, and we need to start listening to these voices in the middle.
Yes, because the danger is, of course, that these are such powerful, I would say, images of two women in these two extreme positions that could completely blot out the people in the middle. Now, of course, you'd also point out that both women have certain similarities, though they have very different political opinions. They're ambitious, they're bold, they're fearless, they're intelligent, both have their own charisma, that's why they have so much of a following. What do you think the trajectory is for the Muslim world, for Muslim women? The trajectory, as it were, for young Muslim women growing up in this post-9/11 world? And remember, the Muslim world is 1.5 billion people, so a lot of Muslim women are growing up, these models in front of them. Where do you think that is going? Are they going more towards Ayaan Hirsi Ali, or towards Aafia Siddiqui, or towards the mainstream middle? Because, you know, I have my own opinion, and I'd first like to hear yours and then talk about it.
Well, I think it's definitely towards the middle. I mean, to the extent that you can generalize, as you say, about such a vast population, you know, it depends. And I haven't noticed that Ayaan Hirsi Ali really has such a following among Muslim women. I mean, that's one of the problems that she had politically in the Netherlands, was that Muslim women were actually quite opposed to her. Because she was seen more as a critic of Islam and of Muslims than as a feminist, which is really how she's seen by Westerners. Now, Aafia Siddiqui, she does have a huge following in Pakistan, but I don't know that I see women really wanting to follow in her footsteps. I see them as more feeling that she's sort of a symbol of Pakistan, and the way that Pakistanis feel that they've been treated by the West, Aafia is kind of a symbol of that. But I see the Muslim world in general as, you know, being shaped by the giant forces of globalization that are shaping all of us, and that's pulling a lot more people towards the middle. That's making big changes for women all across the board, as we saw with the Arab Spring.
Well, Deborah, you raised the G word, globalization.
Yes.
And that's again something I found fascinating in your study as an anthropologist, looking at society, looking at change in society. You set the context for these two characters you pick up from different parts of the world in the context of these massive global changes taking place. And I found that quite fascinating. The changes, the social media, the instant communications, the massive migrations of populations, and both their lives. Follow Aafia. Her family's from India, come to Pakistan, go to Zambia, come to the United States, and she ends up in prison in the United States.
Yes.
Hirsi Ali, same, Somalia, Kenya, lands up in Saudi Arabia, comes to Holland and the United States, and here arrives as a celebrity and is treated as a celebrity. The Time magazine had her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and of course her present husband, Professor Ferguson, dedicated his new book to her, so she's a celebrity figure. So I find that this whole frame of globalization makes the interesting, but the subject of Muslim women particularly interesting. Muslim societies undergoing change, and tribal societies and city societies, as we are seeing with at the Arab Spring, but particularly Muslim women, because they have to find their own way in this new world, you know, where the men have been sidelined in their lives. You know, they have really been forced to make decisions. Are they going to join the more militant groups? Are they going to hold on to their moderation, as it were, or to rediscover some kind of accommodation? How do you see this in the context of globalization? How do you see Muslim women being able to respond to the forces of globalization? You feel that they are responding positively? You give the example of the Arab Spring. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, both Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Aafia Siddiqui are very much products of globalization, just as you described their lives, the change, the moves that they've made. And I think that also shaped their approach to Islam and to identity. Because they had moved around so much, Aafia chose to seek her identity within Islam rather than as a Pakistani, for example. Ayaan Hirsi Ali chose to seek her identity as a Westerner, not as a Dutch woman, not as an American, but as a Westerner. She sees herself as part of the West. And I think that that's something that Muslim women are facing now too. As tribal identities break down, as ethnic identities break down, people are searching for larger identities. And that's why Islamism, that's one of the reasons it's had such a pull for the last couple of decades. But we also see another form of identity which is based on human rights, modern ideas of human rights, and that's something that's coming up, and I hope we're going to be seeing more of it in the future in the Muslim world. One of the most interesting things happening today is the women's rights movement, for example, in Iran. Where you see young women, although they're very much persecuted right now by the government, but still they're joining these campaigns like the Million Signatures campaign. So I think in the future we might see another wave of activism coming from the Muslim world, from Muslim women in terms of human rights and democracy.
Well, you're right, because I meet so many really inspiring women, especially from the Muslim world, because I understand the kinds of pressures on them and the challenges they face, and that they're constantly able to cope with those challenges. And it's not easy with the world in turmoil. Literally, their worlds have been shattered in many cases. Families completely shattered, as in the cases of both these right. The subject of your particular book. Coming back to both of them in the context of their own societies, I think you very successfully point out that Hirsi Ali's personal experiences, the disruption of her life. Remember, the Somali have been divided, the land of Somalia, these are traditional people, they've been there for centuries in the Horn of Africa, but in more recent times, these people have been divided into three nations, into Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and parts of Djibouti. So in a sense, families have been split, cut in half, and that's disruption to start with. Then many of them have gone abroad seeking jobs like her family. And then this internal conflict where they're looking at their own world, tribalism, and the modern world through television and the media and so on. And Hirsi Ali's experiences with tribal Islam, for example, female circumcision, which is not Islam, and categorically we want to put it on record, it is not Islam. Like honor killings, it is associated with Islam in many rural and tribal societies, but it is not sanctioned by Islam. The notion of the importance of the lineage, the clan, the lineage, the code of honor, which emphasizes revenge. Now these are all very tribal. These are tribal in the Horn of Africa, they are tribal in Afghanistan, in North Pakistan, but they are still not Islamic. So her reaction and revulsion against what she sees as her society, her Muslim society, I think it may well be explained by the environment that she's growing up. So she rejects it. She said, this is the kind of world I don't want. It's restrictive, it's terrible to women, and it is, there's no doubt about it. And so she rejects it, and in a sense conflates two things, tribalism and Islam as a world religion. Afia, coming from the other side, does something similar, because you point out, and again I think that's something I hope is picked up by your reader, you open your book on page 1, in fact, you have a reference to Sir Syed Ahmed Khan. Now that's very significant, because Syed, in fact, Deborah, please explain who he is, and then I'll come back to my question.
Well, he was an Indian Muslim living during the Raj in Britain, and he advised Muslims that the way for them to cope with the rise of the West and the Western takeover was to educate themselves, and particularly to learn British ways, so as to be able to revive the Muslim nation. And he started many schools, particularly Akbar University, so that's one way that Muslims have sought to cope with the rise of the West. The other way, of course, which I talk about in the book, is the way of Deoband, which is more of a turning inward to Islam and seeking the resources from within Islam rather than within studying the West.
Exactly. So, in fact, you pointed out to Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, and for our viewers, so Syed Ahmed Khan is a seminal figure in history. He comes in the middle of the 19th century. The British have just taken over India, direct rule. Queen Victoria is now the Empress of India. And the Muslims of India now have to respond. And they respond in two distinct ways. So Syed Ahmed creates a university called Aligarh University, which is still very much thriving in India, in modern India. And another institution is created called Deoband. So two Muslim responses to modernity. One is saying we can live as Muslims with honor, with dignity, and we can play cricket. And as you know, both India and Pakistan learned to play cricket even better than their masters, the former masters, the British. We speak English, we wear a tie, we put on the blazer, we read books in English, we say our prayers. So we are proud to be both Muslim and subjects of the British Empire. So this is a model he gives, which in fact creates generations of Muslims, presidents, prime ministers, scientists, leaders, And the other model, the Deoband model, believes that Islam is under threat. You have to create boundaries around yourself.
Right.
You have to keep out the modern world.
Right.
And therefore you must emphasize the purity of original Islam going back to the 7th century.
Right.
And there you have a kind of inherent conceptual opposition to each other. What I find fascinating in your study, and this is a great link that you made between Aafia, whose family actually goes to Aligarh, a maternal uncle and so on. So she's coming out of the Aligarh tradition, not herself, because she's born after the creation of Pakistan, in Pakistan, but certainly her family. And yet she adopts a philosophy which is almost the opposite, which is the Deoband philosophy.
Right.
She marries, one of her husbands is a relative of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's wanted for all kinds of things, including the murder of Danny Pearl, the father of my great friend Professor Judea Pearl, and of course for the involvement with 9/11. So in a sense, you're seeing Aafia, a product of one tradition associating with another. Were you able to make any explanation or sense of this?
Well, I think this kind of schizophrenia is very common in Pakistan, where you see this dualism in a lot of people, not just in Aafia, where people are coming out of the Sir Syed tradition. They're seeking a Western education. They're very Westernized. They may speak English, maybe their language that they speak at home, and yet they're also drawn to this tradition of Deoband, and that was true of Aafia's family, her whole family. Both her parents were highly educated. Her father was a doctor. Her mother was a social worker and a preacher. And they came out of this Western schooling, and yet they were very serious Deobandis as well. I think that's a big part of Pakistan's story.
Yes, it is, and you're right, because there's so many ideologies in play right now in Pakistan. We must be careful here, Deborah, because Deoband is a school of thought.
Yeah.
And we must be careful as not to suggest that they preach violence, because they don't.
Right.
In fact, they're traditionalists. They're like traditionalists in any other faith,
Right.
you know, any of the great world faiths, where they say, basically, we want to be left alone to practice our own. Now, certainly from them, and even from the modernists, you will have extremists coming out. I mean, some of these modernists, that young man who wanted to blow up bits of New York, if you remember, he was caught. Now, he was a modernist. You know, he was in every sense a modernist, coming from the frontier province. So we need to be careful about not mixing up a philosophy or a school of thought with the action of some individuals. And you pointed out to the schizophrenia, that the debates taking place in Pakistan, and I would say in many parts of the Muslim world right now, not just Pakistan, where there's an intense debate about the nature of Islam. You point to the war on terror, the 9/11 and post 9/11 events, and how all that gets involved with these debates that are taking place. How do you see the impact of 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan on these debates taking place in Hirsi Ali's background country, the Horn of Africa, East Africa, and South Asia, where Aafia comes from?
Well, you know, part of this Deobandi tradition that I was speaking of with Aafia is, as you said, it's a sense that Islam is under threat. And I think this has been greatly magnified during the post 9/11 years because of these wars, because of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion of Iraq. There is this sense that Islam is in peril. It seems to have vindicated this point of view, which was, of course, the Al-Qaeda point of view, that this 9/11 was some sort of response to a Western assault against Islam. So the difficulty now for the West in the Muslim world is trying to convince the Muslim world that we don't have designs upon it, and that things are going to calm down now, and that Islam is not under threat.
And how do you think the U.S. could do that, considering these two models?
Considering these two models, I don't think either of these two models it would be helpful to doing that, because Ayaan Hirsi Ali, what she argues is that Islam itself is dangerous, and that until Islam is radically changed, the West is going to be, as she puts it, at war with Islam. And as long as, if that's really the point of view of the US government, which I don't think it is, but if it were, that would vindicate this sense of grievance and fear throughout the entire Muslim world. But fortunately, that's not the position of the US government.
No, it isn't, because in fact, every president, President Obama, President Bush, and so many senior figures, General Petraeus and so on, have constantly talked about winning hearts and minds. And they've repeated that we need to win hearts and minds in the Muslim world because we have hundreds of thousands of troops in Iraq, Afghanistan, we have relations with Pakistan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, which are all Muslim countries. So in a sense, this also counterbalances their position, which is to reach out and make friends. But similarly, Aafia is not going to make many friends in the West. You can't come here and say we'll blow you all up or become Muslim unless you become Muslim and then hope to have any kind of positive response from people, especially in an environment where there's already so much controversy. So what does that leave us with when you have these two main characters in this book and we have no one else as an alternative? What would you suggest we look towards in terms of people who can build some bridges between the two civilizations?
Well, I think, as you said earlier, we look towards the middle. I mean, we look towards the thousands and thousands and thousands of people, Muslims every day, who are working to build bridges between the West and Islam and to, improve the situation in their own home countries. And there's no shortage of those people at all. But what this book shows, though, is that that there are these two polarizing figures became very popular during the War on Terror, and in a way, people like that kind of feed off of each other because as long as there is an Aafia, people like Ayaan feel justified to say, well, we're under threat by Muslims, and vice versa. So the book is really about extremism, but that's not where we can look for any solution to our problems.
Yes, because any Muslim, whether he's moderate or secular or orthodox, when he knows that Hirsi Ali describes Islam as a nihilistic, destructive cult of death, he's going to say, hey, wait a minute, that's supposed to be my culture, my civilization.
Exactly.
Whatever he may or she may have their own reservations about Islam. And similarly, Aafia, it's going to be very difficult to convince people that somehow this is a person we can do business with because she's so involved with all the militancy that happens after 9/11. The challenge, of course, Deborah, is for someone like you, and we'll come to the method with which you prepared this book and research for it. The challenge is, how do you communicate these rather complex ideas to an American audience, which is really going to be seeing these two extreme women? How are you going to convey some of the discussion we've been having?
Well, the way that I try to do it in the book is simply through telling their two stories, and particularly the reaction that other people had to these women in their lives, in different points in their lives. So by seeing that, you're able to see, for example, what the reaction of Muslims is, and you see that there's a very varied reaction. There's by no means are people lining up behind these women, and in lockstep following them. Not at all. You see with Aafia Siddiqui, for example, her first husband, who was a Pakistani doctor, and he came to the United States and was doing his training here and was married to her in an arranged marriage. And she tried to get him involved with these jihadi groups, and he refused, and he ultimately divorced her. He didn't agree with her at all, and neither did his family. That wasn't their interpretation of the religion in the slightest. With Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you see the reaction that Muslim women who are working as feminists in the Muslim community in the Netherlands, who have opened shelters for battered women, what was their reaction to her and her attacks on Islam? They didn't find that to be helpful to them in their cause at all. So that's how I try to show in the book what, of course, and I have to say there were people who did agree with them and thought they were fantastic, and you have to, so you see the range of opinion.
Yes, and also the context in both countries. In Pakistan, so many ordinary Pakistanis are so fed up of the militancy, the violence, this this post 9/11 period of history has plunged their societies into. People overlook, Deborah, that something like 50,000 Pakistanis have died as a result of the events after 9/11.
Yeah.
And they'll constantly complain. They'll say, look, we had nothing to do with 9/11. Not one of the terrorists on that day was a Pakistani. And yet our societies are in turmoil because of this. Ordinary Muslims, Pakistanis, moderates are constantly being killed. Constantly. You know, the schools, girls' schools are being blown up. Mosques are being blown up. Passenger buses are being blown up. And no one knows what's happening. So these are societies in great turmoil. Deborah, a little bit about methodology, how you approach this book. I think the way you laid it out, you have short chapters, alternating. So you have a chapter on one, then a chapter on the other. And therefore, it almost reads like a very fast-moving novel, I would almost say, because both lives are running in parallel, and one never gets too bored, because before you are even finish the chapter, 2-3 pages, you're on to the next one, and you're back again. So I found that very interesting. Now, was this a deliberate choice of yours?
Yes, it was very deliberate, and the reason was because I really wanted to show how historically the same historical time period was affecting these two very different personalities. You know, so.
Let's take a short break and we'll be back.
Okay.
On the Go, Afterwards is available via podcast through iTunes and XML. Visit booktv.org and click Podcasts on the upper left side of the page. Select which podcast you'd like to download and listen to Afterwards while you travel.
Deborah, just before the break, we were about to talk about methodology, how you approach this book. Tell us something about the travels you undertook to research for this book.
Well, probably the biggest thing was that I actually moved my family to Amsterdam, and we ended up staying there for 4 years. So that was probably the single biggest undertaking, because Ayaan Hirsi Ali was in the Netherlands when I first started working on the book in 2005. And so I thought I would go there and be able to understand better the milieu that had produced her. She, as you may know, ended up coming to the United States in 2006, but by that time I was already in Amsterdam, so I stayed there. I also went to Africa, to Kenya, which is where she's from, and of course I visited Pakistan a number of times to research Aafia. I also came to Boston because Aafia lived in Boston for about 10 years, so all in all it was a lot of traveling.
Many years.
Yes.
Were you able to meet these two, either of the two?
No, I never was. Well, I never was able to interview them. Ayaan Hirsi Ali refused my request for an interview. Now, I did go to public events where she was speaking at, and sometimes I stood up and asked questions, but I never met her on a one-to-one basis. And Aafia Siddiqui, she was missing for most of the time that I was working on the book, and then after she was captured, she was being held in jail and she wasn't allowed to see the media. But I did go to her trial, and I sat just a few rows behind her and, you know, was able to see her in action, as it were, in the courtroom.
And when you went to their societies, in Kenya, for example, you must have talked to many people from her ethnic background, the Somali.
Did, yeah.
What did you take from those interviews?
Well, it was fascinating. The neighborhood where she grew up, which is called Eastleigh in Nairobi, it was much as she described it in her book, in Infidel. And I did have a funny encounter. At one point, I wanted to. She mentions in one of her books that she used to attend these meetings of the Muslim Brotherhood at a Muslim community center, which was near the school that she attended. So I went to this Muslim community center thinking I would try to see if there was anyone who knew her or who remembered her. And so I was ushered into the women's section of the community center, and I had a copy of Ayaan's book with me, and it said Infidel. on the front of it. And so one of these young women said, "Oh, what's that book? Infidel, who's this?" And they didn't remember her at all, but they were fascinated by the book. And she said, "She's going to be like Salman Rushdie if she's calling herself an infidel. She could get herself killed." And it was really just like someone out of the pages of her book was speaking. So
you got a sense of what it's like on the ground. Did you get a sense of this tribal society that she's coming from?
Well, a little bit, but this was in Kenya, and these are Somalis who have migrated to Kenya. The community that she grew up in was, in Somali terms, sort of an upper class group of Somalis, because these are the people who left Somalia and then formed the basis of the rebel movement that eventually overthrew Siad Barre, the Somali dictator. Her father was a leading politician. So there were people who were coming out of a tribal society into an urban society and trying to make that adjustment. And that was the very difficult adjustment that her family went through while she was growing up in Kenya. And Ayaan has obviously been very successful, but both her brother and her sister kind of suffered tragic fates. They were not able to make that jump between.
So what happened to them?
Well, her sister died, probably committed suicide. She suffered from mental illness. Her brother has also suffered from mental illness, and he lives in Kenya, but he's never really been able to make anything of himself.
Because she adores her father, and he's one of the charismatic leaders of the Darood clan of the Somali. Right. And again, are these cases reflecting the larger tragedy of these peoples who are constantly being moved around and facing all kinds of challenges?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And Ayaan talks about that in her books, how her mother, for example, was illiterate and came to Kenya, and she wanted her children to get an education. But she didn't really know how to help them to get that education because she herself hadn't gone to school. So all the children were brilliant. They were very, very intelligent. But she had a hard time keeping them focused into going to school. And in fact, Ayaan's sister and brother never did actually graduate. And
Ayaan, of course, is being driven by this sense of learning, growing in one sense, like Aafia goes to MIT, gets a PhD, etc. And that again is at the base of Islamic learning, as you know, that the urge to learn, it's very much at the core of Islam. And I would say it's a feature that's lost to many Muslims. They don't even recognize this. What about Aafia? Deborah, you talked about Pakistan and the debates going on within Pakistan society. Were you able to talk to any members of her family in Karachi?
Not really. I did have some email contact with different members of her family, and I was very much in touch with her lawyers. So, I was able to get that side of the story from them. But her family did not cooperate with me. I did have contact with her former in-laws from her first marriage and her first husband. So I did get to know them a little bit and learn from them something about what Aafia had been like before she disappeared. I also got to know some people in Boston who had known her as a student and as a young scientist and mother.
And what was their impression? Was there any hint that one day she'd turn out like she did turn out?
Well, in a way, because she was well known in Boston as a student, as a fundraiser for jihad. She started out during the Bosnian Civil War, and she was raising money for the Bosnian Mujahideen, fighting to defend the Bosnian Muslims. And then she, as time went on, she began to see the United States as the enemy of Muslims. So people who knew her well, people who knew her in Boston knew that about her. So it wasn't perhaps that surprising.
Now, Boston is, of course, not dangerous for a journalist like you writing a book on Aafia, but Karachi would have been. What were your feelings? After all, this is the city where they committed that shocking murder of Danny Pearl. What were your feelings as an American journalist, female journalist in Karachi, pursuing this story?
Well, I talk about that in the book a bit. Particularly when I first went to Pakistan for this to write about Aafia. I knew that she was accused of having worked for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who of course had also been the one to kill Danny Pearl. I had known Danny Pearl very slightly in Atlanta when he and I were both reporters there. So I found it frightening to think that I was delving into the world of someone associated with his murderer. And I approached a man called Khalid Hawaja, who was known as a conduit between jihadis and journalists, and who Daniel Pearl had also approached when he was trying to get in touch with Sheikh Gilani, which ultimately led to his murder. I approached Khalid Hawaja and asked him for any information about Aafia, and he tried very hard to talk me out of pursuing the story. And he said, you should bear in mind what happened to Daniel Pearl. So that did.
He was in a sense almost implicitly threatening you.
Yeah, I couldn't, at the time, I couldn't decide whether he really was threatening me or whether I was being paranoid about it. So I just went ahead with the story. But then later, I went back to see Khalid Hawaja years later after Aafia had been captured, and he sort of laughed and he said, I actually was trying to steer you away from that story. I was trying to get you off of that. Because he said, at that time I thought she was hiding. She might be hiding, and I thought it would be better if you just left her alone. But of course, now I know that she was in a secret prison because he was part of the people arguing that was the case. And so anyway, but he admitted that he had been trying to steer me away from it.
Deborah, give us a sense of the dangers on the ground for a young journalist, in case some of our viewers are planning to go into your profession, journalism, out there in the Muslim world. You're in Karachi, a city of something like 16, 17, 18 million people. It's law and order problems. People are being picked up for and kidnapped, hostage taking, shootouts, all kinds of things going on. And there you are now. Just describe, where were you located? How did you move around? What were your feelings?
Well, I mean, I'm fortunate that I have a number of friends who are Pakistani journalists, and I never work by myself when I'm in Pakistan. I wouldn't presume to. I always try to work together with a Pakistani journalist. I mean, they know the situation on the ground. They understand what we're getting into, and fortunately, because of that, I've never had any problems in Pakistan. But Karachi is an enormous city. Karachi is bigger. Karachi, the city of Karachi has the population of the entire country of the Netherlands. And it's very chaotic. There are people pouring into the city. No one knows who is there. There's a lot of hostage taking for money that goes on. The Taliban is very active in the city. One of the interviews that I did was with the family of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and that was a little, even though it was at a lawyer's office and it was absolutely perfectly civilized, I couldn't help but sort of wonder, especially since it was on the same day as the Marriott bombing.
In Karachi?
Well, the Marriott was bombed in Islamabad, but I was meeting them in Karachi at their lawyer's office. But it reminded me that they were associated with some very, very dangerous people.
And where were you staying in Karachi?
I stayed at different places in Karachi, different hotels. I used to stay at the Sheraton, but in the last couple of years I've tried to stay in smaller Pakistani hotels that wouldn't be so much of a target. Just very small sort of guest house type of hotels.
Yes, because these big hotels have been attacked in Karachi and Islamabad. Another aspect of this war on terror that you've been discussing involves the rather murky doings and dealings of some of the leaders in the Muslim world. You mentioned President General Pervez Musharraf, then President of Pakistan, and his involvement with the Aafia Siddiqui case. Could you comment on that?
Well, he, at the time, what happened is Aafia was listed as wanted for questioning in March 2003. And at that point, she disappeared from her mother's house. Now, she later told the FBI that what she did is she went to the family of Ali Abdul Aziz Ali, who is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew. And she says that she married him while she was at their house. And they were briefly married up until he was captured. He was arrested in April 2003. And she says that after that time, she was on the run. Now, General Musharraf, during this period, his government said that they had conflicting stories at first. There was a kind of a flurry of reports that she had been arrested, that she hadn't been arrested.
These are the official stories.
Right. And then his government said, she was never arrested, we don't know where she is, and we have no idea. But a lot of people didn't believe them, and her family now, after she was captured, they started to claim that she had actually been arrested back in 2003 and was held by the Pakistani government in a secret prison or handed over to the FBI or the CIA, both of which the US government denies. But President Musharraf, he never actually said anything specifically about Aafia. But many people believe that Aafia had the protection of the ISI when she was in hiding because they believe that the Pakistani intelligence had to know where she was during the whole period from 2003 to 2008.
And why was that? Would they assume that the ISI was behind a kidnapping or that she was working for them?
Well, there are both theories. Okay, there are people who believe Aafia's family, they believe that she was kidnapped, and they believe that the ISI was holding her. Now, I have to say that that's not borne out by the evidence that was presented at her trial, because Aafia herself confessed to the FBI that she had been hiding, not in any secret prison, during those years. But Aafia said that she was followed during those years by the intelligence agency, and that they knew where she was.
Now this is before she's taken to Afghanistan.
Yes. One of the mysteries about Aafia is how she ended up in Afghanistan, and that is something that I've never been able to answer. And the judge at her sentencing said, despite the thousands of pages of classified documents that he had seen, he still was unable to answer that question.
Now, if the judge can't answer it and the author can't answer it, we, the public, are confused.
Yeah.
Because this, Deborah, this is a huge question mark hanging over Aafia's case.
Yes.
And there's like a big missing chunk of her life. She's picked up she goes underground or disappears in 2003.
Yeah.
And then reappears, 5 years later?
5 years later.
In a jail, in a prison in Afghanistan. And then there are all kinds of stories about what happens, and then she turns up in the United States. So can you try to fill some of this in for us?
Okay, so she disappeared in 2003. She wasn't seen. There were a couple of people in her family say that they saw her, there's one or two sightings during the period 2003 to 2008. But basically, she was out of sight for all of those years, 5 years, with her 3 children. Then suddenly, in July 2008, some men notice a woman wearing a burqa with a small boy outside of a mosque in Ghazni, Afghanistan. And there had been reports in Ghazni that a woman was going around with a young boy trying to encourage Afghan women to become suicide bombers. So when these merchants saw this woman and a young boy sitting outside of a mosque, they thought she might be a suicide bomber. They called the police, and when the police came, they started questioning this woman. They found that she had a bag filled with documents written in English and Urdu and Pashto, with diagrams of maps of Ghazni, with diagrams of weapons, and they thought it was very suspicious. They decided to take her into custody to the police station in Ghazni without knowing who she was. They took these documents over to the local American base, which was near there. When the Americans looked at it, they found a document that was called written in English, called "Why I Am Not a Terrorist," and it was about
why I am not a terrorist.
Why I am not a terrorist, and it was talking about going to MIT. And so they called the FBI and said, you know, we think this woman, either she may be American or she may have some associations with Americans. Would you like to come and question her? And the FBI said they would very much. They flew in a team and they went down to the police station to try to take this woman into custody. The Afghans refused to let them. It said that they were planning to keep her themselves. The Americans thought they were going to a meeting with the Afghans to discuss this whole thing and to see whether they could get access to the woman. They went into a room. There was a curtain in the room, and what they didn't realize, this was what came out at her trial, was that the woman was behind the curtain, sitting unsecured. One of the Americans put his rifle down, took his rifle off and put it down beside him. And what they say happened is the next minute, the curtain flies open, the woman picks up the rifle and starts to fire it into the crowd of Americans and Afghans who were sitting there. The American spun around, he fires back and hits her. The Americans pick up the woman, run out to their vehicles with her. She's gravely wounded. They take her, they fly her from Ghazni to Bagram Air Base, and it was only at that point that they were able to make a positive identification, and they found out that this woman was actually Aafia Siddiqui, who had been missing all those 5 years.
What a dramatic story. So we don't really know what happened to those 5 years. So
what was she doing there? Well, how did she end up sitting outside of that mosque? Yes. I mean, there are several different possibilities about what it could be. Aafia herself claimed that she'd gone there looking for her husband, the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. That doesn't really make sense because the entire world knew that he was at Guantanamo at that time. There's the possibility that she was distributing these documents that she was carrying with her to the Taliban. There's the possibility that she was meeting with women to talk about suicide bombing, which was the initial
And they
report.
also, Deborah, she's from Karachi. She doesn't speak Pashto.
No.
The women of Ghazni would only speak Pashto.
Yeah.
So how is she convincing people on this very complicated business of becoming suicide bombers when they may not be inclined to, without speaking the language? So there's a very strange kind of story. And now, what did President Musharraf say about all this? Because you do have some sections of the book on Musharraf explaining this.
Well, he said that they never had her in custody, that he certainly never handed her over to the Americans. So he has just washed his hands of it. I mean, he's
washed his hands. He said basically we didn't know anything about it.
Yeah.
And has there been any position, as it were, of the government of Pakistan? Because the present Prime Minister Gilani, has been talking about her in high tones and wanting her back. What is the position?
Absolutely. The present government of Pakistan has tried very hard to get her back. After she was flown to Bagram Air Base, she was operated on, and then she was flown to New York City, and she was charged with firing that weapon into the crowd of Americans. She was never charged with terrorism. She was only charged with firing that weapon and attempted murder of those U.S. soldiers. At that point, the Pakistani government immediately started saying that she was a daughter of the nation and that they would try very hard to get her back. They ended up allotting, the Pakistani Senate allotted $2 million for Aafia's defense, which is really extraordinary in a poor country like Pakistan, where $2 million could keep the Karachi court system going for a little while. But they hired what they called a dream team of lawyers to defend Aafia. And they've really done everything you can imagine to try to get her back, but so far they haven't been able to.
So in a sense, Deborah, these are ongoing stories.
Yes,
Thank you.
And she's still a big issue in Pakistan.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was